Hello, welcome to this revision homework as part of our inquiry question of how could the Holocaust have happened. In this lesson, we're going to think about the question, how were Jewish people persecuted in the Middle Ages? And in particular, in the lesson today, we're going to focus on the events at Cliffords Tower in York in the year 1190. So just begin by looking at this timeline of key events that took place, and I just want you to have a think about the question, what can you infer about how Jewish people have been treated through time? Now, if you have a look at that, you can see that William the Conqueror invited Jewish people to come and live in England after the Norman conquest of 1066. Between 1100 and 1135, Jewish people were given protection by King Henry I, who of course was one of the sons of William the Conqueror. However, in March 1190, an extremely tragic event happened, which was a mass suicide and massacre of Jewish people at Clifford's Tower in York. So we're going to really focus in on that event in our lesson today. You can see there as well in 1290, King Edward I expelled Jewish people from England. And there was a period of time in the late Middle Ages where Jewish people weren't living in England. And in the 1650s, Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell invited Jewish people to come back and live in England in the middle of the 1650s. Now, in 19th century Europe, there was anti-Semitism taking place across Europe. There were pogroms, which are organised outbreaks of violence that took place in Russia. There were attacks against Jewish people in France after an event known as the Dreyfus Affair. And between 1933 and 1945, as we're learning about as our key inquiry question, there was anti-Semitism against Jewish people in Germany, which led to the murder of 6 million Jewish people in an event known as the Holocaust. So in terms of the chronology and when these events happened, you can see a timeline there stretching through the different time periods that we study within our historical learning. So the Middle Ages, medieval times, the early modern period, the era of the Industrial Revolution, 1750 to 1900, the 20th century and the 21st century. And we can see there where some of the key events that I've just talked about come in, things like 1066, King Henry I giving Jewish people special protection, 1190, the mass suicide massacre of Jewish people at Cliffords Tower in York, the period of time that Jewish people were banned from England, 1656 is the date that Oliver Cromwell invited Jewish people to return to England, and of course 1933 to 1945, the era of Nazi Germany and the persecution of Jewish people leading to the Holocaust. So the main historical concepts in this learning that we're going to focus on in this lesson is anti-Semitism, which means racism towards people who are Jewish. A massacre is the killing of a group of people. The Crusades were a series of religious wars in the Middle Ages when soldiers from Christian countries in Europe sought to take over Muslim lands. These lands were seen as the holy lands of the Christian religion. A mob is a large group of people, especially one that is disorderly and intent on causing trouble or violence. And the blood libel is the wrongful accusation in the Middle Ages that Jewish people killed Christian boys as part of their religion. This was, of course, completely untrue. So today we're going to focus on an event that took place at Clifford's Tower in York. So you can see this plaque here, which you can actually see at the bottom of Clifford's Tower in York. It's not far to go to. It's definitely well worth a visit. And it says here, on the night of Friday the 16th of March 1190, some 150 Jews and Jewesses of York, having sought protection in the royal castle on the site from a mob incited by Richard Malabis and others, chose to die at each other's hands rather than renounce their faith. So we're going to find out what happened in this event in this lesson today. So there was anti-Semitism, which is racism towards Jewish people, that took place in the Middle Ages, and that provides a little bit of context of the events that took place at Cliffords Tower in 1190. So the first thing to talk about, we've introduced that to you a little bit, is something called the blood libel. So Jewish people living in England in the 12th century began to be accused of something called the blood libel. This was when Jewish people were falsely accused of murdering young Christian boys for what was believed to be a Jewish religious ritual. The accusation was, of course, completely untrue. Now, this began in England after the Jews of Norwich were falsely accused of murdering a boy called William of Norwich in 1144. William became a martyr, which is when you believe that somebody dies for their beliefs, and similar accusations followed and could be found in other cities across England in the 12th century. You can see here there's a source here, 13th century source, an English manuscript. It shows Jewish people being beaten. The figures in blue and yellow are wearing a badge in the shape of 2 tablets to identify them as being Jewish people. And then when the Black Death broke out in England in 1348, some people in England blamed it on Jewish people. They claimed that Jewish people had poisoned the wells to spread the disease. So it's important that we understand that there was anti-Semitism that was taking place in England in the Middle Ages. And that helps us to understand our key inquiry question about how the Holocaust could have happened, as we've studied about how, unfortunately, there has been anti-Semitism towards Jewish people through time. And it's important, therefore, that we understand that the Holocaust was not an isolated historical event, and that we're able to understand what happened tragically to Jewish people both before and also after that event. And that's really, really important for us to remember when we're thinking about this key historical question of how could the Holocaust have happened. So we're going to look at the question, why did tensions between Jewish people and Christians grow in the 12th century? So we found out that Jewish people came to settle in England after the Norman conquest. King Henry I had offered protection to Jewish people in England. Now, English kings were keen to protect Jewish people, as many Jewish people at the time were rich, not all of them, but many were rich, and therefore they paid high taxes to the king. So there's an economic factor here for the kings of England, like Henry I, protecting the Jewish people. Tensions grew in the 12th century, and this was because there was some resentment, which means jealousy, about Jewish wealth. Christians were not allowed to lend money, and so some Jewish people were money lenders and had become quite wealthy as a result of that. The Crusades as well saw a lot of anti-Jewish propaganda. Propaganda means almost like political advertising, as well as anti-Muslim propaganda. So there was very much a sense, I think, in England in the 12th century that the Christian religion was the correct religion, and it caused people in England to be against other religions such as Judaism and Islam. There were also anti-Jewish riots in English cities after the coronation, the crowning of King Richard I in 1189, after an untrue rumour that he had ordered the massacre of Jewish people. Okay, so what about Jewish people in York in the 12th century? Well, many Jewish people in York had become wealthy in the 12th century. That was because of their role as moneylenders to people within York. The Jewish people of York had charged interest for lending money, which of course is perfectly normal when money is lent. Cliffords Tower was a place where Jewish people could go to in times of danger for protection. Now, the Jews at the time had been under the special protection of various kings of England. We've already talked about King Henry I, and they were under the protection of King Richard I, who became the King of England in 1189. And this was because Jewish people were a source of enormous wealth to the crown. They lent money and were also an important source of tax. Now, in the year 1190, in March 1190, riots broke out in York. And the Jewish people sought refuge in Cliffords Tower as they were under the protection of the king at the time, King Richard I. The local people in York, however, besieged the tower, and it was also set on fire. So faced with the choice of being burnt in the tower or killed by the waiting mob, many Jewish people chose to end their own lives, to kill themselves. Those left were promised safety by the locals if they converted to Christianity. However, the mob went back on their promise and they massacred the Jewish people, and 150 Jewish people died in the massacre. And I think it's really important when we learn about something that we reflect on the tragic human consequence of this. 150 people killed, each of those people an individual with their own lives and their own story. It's really important that we remember that when we think about figures and statistics like that in history. So let's just find out what happened in a little bit more detail. So after his coronation in July 1189, King Richard I ordered that all Jews in England must be protected. However, as soon as he left on crusade in March 1190, riots against Jews and Jewish properties broke out in England, and this of course happened in York as well. So in March 1190, houses in York were burning. Jews were blamed, and the families of a wealthy Jew called Barak, who'd been murdered in 1189, were attacked by a mob. Barak's widow and children were killed. Now Jossi, who was the leader of the Jews in York, took his family to the safety of Clifford's Tower, and he urged all the Jews of York to follow him. So about 150 Jewish people ended up seeking refuge in Clifford's Tower. But the tower's warden let the Jewish people into Clifford's Tower. He thought they would be safe and under protection of the king and that nobody would attack. However, a huge crowd from York besieged the tower for days. Part of the tower was set alight, and the Jews could not leave, though, as they would be attacked. The warden went to the sheriff, who was called John Marshall, to help, and the sheriff told the people of York and called in a group of soldiers called a militia. The Jews thought the warden might have done a deal with the mob, though, and when the warden returned, the Jews had locked the doors of the tower. On the night of Friday the 15th of March, some Jews decided to kill themselves rather than convert to Christianity. Husbands killed their wives and their children, and then they killed one another. At dawn, those who survived begged the crowd to let them out. They promised to do what the mob wanted and allow themselves to be baptized as Christians. The mob agreed with this. But when the surviving Jews emerged from Clifford's Tower, the mob massacred them. Men, women and children were killed, and 150 Jewish people died in total. So this shows you a bit of a picture so you can understand a little bit about the history of Clifford's Tower. Clifford's Tower was rebuilt after 1190, and this is how it might have appeared in the 14th century. So in terms of why the massacre took place, you can have a look at this evidence and you can start to infer some reasons about why the massacre maybe took place. So Richard Malabis, the member of the nobility who led the mob attacking Clifford's Tower, was deeply in debt to the Jews. After the Jews were massacred, the mob went to the cathedral and burnt all the documents detailing money owed to the Jews. The documents had been stored there for safekeeping. And the Third Crusade had begun in 1189. Richard I was basically out of the country for his entire reign, really, on crusade. Many crusaders wanted to target the Jews in England and across Europe first, and the New Jewish Encyclopedia says the cry was, before attempting to revenge ourselves on Muslim unbelievers, let us first revenge ourselves on the killers of Christ living in our midst. Thousands of Jews throughout Europe were massacred and whole Jewish communities were wiped out, and that's quite an important thing for us to remember when we're thinking about what happened at Clifford's Tower and learning about anti-Semitism in both England and Europe in medieval times. So in terms of reflecting on our learning, you've learned today about how Jewish people were treated in medieval England. You've learned today about why there was a massacre of Jews at Clifford's Tower. We can see that racism and that anti-Semitism and also those economic reasons as well. Why the Jews of York were targeted. Richard Malabis himself owed money to Jewish people in York at the time. And this event tells us about, unfortunately, the racism and discrimination and the anti-Semitism that went on in medieval England. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.